So, I'm Eric Saul, and before I say my name, I should say aloha. I love coming to Hawaii. This is, I think, my 25th time to Hawaii. I've been here to many of the Nisei Veterans reunions, starting in 1980. So I went to the 40th anniversary of the founding of the 442nd, the 50th and the 60th, 65th, and the 71st reunions. And I've been twice to France, to Bruyères, where the Japanese-American soldiers liberated a whole group of towns, including Bruyères. So this the genesis of this exhibit, called Unlikely Liberators, starts in 1980. And the whole genesis of documenting Japanese-American history in terms of public exhibitions began in 1980. I was a director of a local history museum called the Presidio Army Museum in San Francisco, and we told the history of the U.S. Army on the West Coast. And I grew up in Los Angeles and then took this job in 1973. And one of the first things I learned when I became director of the museum at the Presidio was the decision to intern Japanese Americans was made and determined and carried out at the very Army base that I was working at, the Presidio of San Francisco. So right after Pearl Harbor, there was a General DeWitt and his assistant, Carl Bendetzen, who was a major, decided that Japanese Americans could not be trusted. Just two people, two Army officers. These Army officers were very articulate. And they actually went up and down the chain of command all the way to the President of the United States, and they convinced the President and the War Department and the Secretary of State and the whole machinery of the government, the Japanese Americans had to be what they called evacuated and interned, which are euphemisms for forced removal and imprisonment. And as you know, the U.S. government on February 19th, 1942, issued Executive Order 9066 from the Presidio Army base that I was in. So as a curator of this base, I said, I have to interpret this event. So we actually did an exhibit on the internment of Japanese Americans, and it was the second only exhibit on the internment of Japanese Americans. And we had the executive order, and we had pictures of the camps. And in 1980, I decided I needed to expand the program to tell the story of Japanese American soldiers in World War II. So the decision to intern, which was catastrophic for 120,000 people, and the loss, the economic loss to 120,000 people was $120 million in 1942 money, which was the equivalent of billions and billions of dollars in today's money. Maybe $3 or $4 billion in economic loss. So the decision, which I found out, and the reason I'm telling you this is because we're going to talk about the Holocaust, we're going to talk about oppression of another minority in Europe. And to me, the irony of young Japanese American soldiers volunteering from the West Coast, half of whom were in internment camps, volunteering for the United States Army, not losing faith, and not losing heart, and deciding to risk their lives to defend a democracy that wouldn't even protect their basic civil rights. You know, and I had known because I had seen the movie Go for Broke with Van Johnson. Have you seen that movie, 1952? In the movie, I saw it as a kid, and I said, wow, what a story, and I always remembered it. So I said, we have to do this story, and have to find out why was it that Japanese Americans didn't lose faith in their country. What was it about their thinking process that would allow them to go into the military? And this was the biggest irony, and it was brought out in the movie a little bit, that they were the most decorated Army unit in the entire 240-year history of the American Army. And that's saying a lot because we're talking about probably 30 million people serving in the military over a period of 240 years. And I calculated there were 2,600 infantry regiments throughout the history of the United States Army. So out of the 2,600 infantry regiments, this was the most decorated. Again, you couldn't make this story up. An oppressed minority who had lost everything, volunteering for service, willingly, volunteering for a very high-risk combat assignment, and then coming out at the other end, the most decorated unit in the entire history of the American Army. And I had the opportunity to interview some of the officers of the 442nd and said, really, what was it about these guys that made them so good? He said they knew that they had to prove their loyalty, and they had to do it in any way possible. And they always were so obedient, and they were smart, articulate, and in many cases the officers told me that they were so smart that a private or a private first class or a corporal in an infantry regiment would command the battalion because he was a college graduate, he was smart, he had the faith of the men, and he had command ability, and they would take over from the officers, and the officers would step back and they would plan their own missions. And that doesn't happen in infantry regiments. And I said, what was it like to discipline them? You know, I was asking the white officers. He said they were really, really well behaved. So he said, but when they ever misbehaved, he said, you know how I would discipline them? I would threaten to write their mothers at home. And then they would behave themselves. So one of the officers I interviewed was Colonel Hanley, who was the commander of the 2nd Battalion. And he just loved the officers, the white officers, said they were the greatest. And to be an officer, command a white officer, a Hakujin Haole officer, was a great honor. And these officers then went on to great careers as a direct result of their association with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. So it was, as I was learning all of these things, the principal question I wanted to know, and I'm telling you kind of anecdotal stuff. So as you greet people and you might have a question, you don't have to remember facts and figures and times and dates of battles. I think everything is sort of conceptual. And the conception is, who were these men? And of course, they were Nisei, and they were second generation Japanese Americans. There were about 300,000 Japanese Americans in the country at the time, which was about 0.2%. The Japanese American population was about 0.2% of the population of the United States. So it was one of the smallest ethnic minorities in the country. And they had been in the country. By the way, this year is 1985, and I'm working on a timeline, a Japanese American history timeline. And what happened on February 8th, you're in Hawaii, let's see if you know your history. On February 8th, 1885, what happened in Honolulu to the Japanese American community? 130 years ago, what happened? You should all know this. And it's funny that I'm the only one that ever thought of it. It is the 130th anniversary of the first Issei coming to Hawaii on the first major boat from Tokyo. And so every year I write to all the Japanese American historical societies and groups and say, let's create a holiday or a national program to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Japanese Americans in Hawaii. And if you go to the Hawaii State Archives, which I did, they have the original treaty, by the way, that King Kalakaua and Emperor Meiji signed that allowed the treaty for Japanese immigrants to come to Hawaii. And it was signed in 1884, and the absolute original one is in the Hawaii State Archives. And they never exhibit it, and I think, wow, what a treasure for Japanese American history. So you have the smallest ethnic minority in the country, came here in 1885, and they didn't have an easy life. I was just talking. They had one of the hardest lives that you could experience as an immigrant coming to this country. So as I was preparing the exhibit, I wanted to know about the pre-war experience of the Issei, so the fathers and the mothers of the veterans. And I found out that in California, Oregon, and in Washington State, there were 509 laws enacted between 1885 and 1942. 509 discriminatory laws against Japanese Americans, Asian Americans, and Filipino Americans. And a lot of those laws were based on the Jim Crow laws of the South. So when the California state legislature wanted to limit the civil rights of new immigrants, they only had to look to the South. So what did they do? They denied the Issei the right of citizenship, of owning land and property, inheritance rights, marriage rights, occupational rights, travel, registration, and on and on and on, all in defiance of the principles of American democracy. My grandmother, who came here in 1905, only had to wait 18 years to become a citizen. But the Isseis, who came here in the 1885, had to wait until 1954-55 for the Walter McCarran Act. So they had to wait 65 years to become citizens. So for 65 years, and a lot of them never lived to be able to become citizens. So in the course of preparing the exhibit, one of my technical advisors was a man named Mike Masaoka. Nobody's ever heard of Mike Masaoka if you're from Hawaii. Has anybody ever heard that name? Mike? So if you were from California, everybody would know the name Mike Masaoka. He was the executive director of the Japanese American Citizen League. And he said to me, Eric, if you want to understand our history, you have to understand what we went through before the war. And you have to understand that our parents were basically indentured servants. They were truck farmers who couldn't own land, and if they leased land, they couldn't lease it for more than 3 or 4 years before they had to re-lease it on another plot of land. But when they had children, they were able to have the land placed in the name of their children who could become citizens. But even the California, Oregon, and the Washington state legislatures tried to repeal the land laws that said you could transfer the name, the title of the land to your children, but they weren't successfully able to do that. So by the beginning of 1942, and again, from being from Hawaii, you wouldn't know this, but Japanese Americans in California were about 3% of the population in California, 0.3% in the United States. But they owned, depending on the crop, between 25 and 40% of the fruits and vegetables produced in the Imperial and the Sacramento Valley. So this tiny minority had come here from rural Japan, were able to scratch out a living and begin to purchase and produce land to the point where they were producing most of the fruits and vegetables that we were eating on the West Coast. So after Pearl Harbor, the vegetable growers, the white vegetable growers, and the fruit growers, and they published a newsletter, and I read it about 5 years. I couldn't believe my ears, my eyes when I read it. They said, here's our opportunity to take away their land. Here's our opportunity to finally get rid of them, and we can get it at 10 cents on the dollar. So the vegetable growers, very powerful, and the Grange lobbied those two officers, lobbied the Army. So the decision to intern Japanese Americans was not honestly done for strategic reasons or suspicion. It was based on economic greed at its worst, absolute worst. So the vast majority of Isseis lost their property as a direct result of the war, and it was purchased by the white fruit and vegetable growers. So it was one of the biggest losses, economic losses, for any group for its size. Absolutely tragic. So when I used to talk to the veterans, and I said, given all that, the 509 discriminatory laws, that you couldn't go to college where you want, you couldn't get a job where you want, you were called the J word, you had to live in little ghettos in little Tokyos and Japan towns. Then, your worst fear, they put you in a prison camp, you and your mother and your father, your sisters and your brothers. So the worst place you could think, to these desolate desert, there was 10 concentration camps. The US government called them concentration camps. And they particularly chose the worst, most inhospitable places to place Japanese Americans. In the remote deserts of Arizona, Wyoming, Utah, Montana, where an Issei man who might have been a dentist, or he might have been a doctor, he might have been a lawyer, or he might have been a community leader publishing a newspaper, was paid $19 a month, $19 as a stipend, and basically lost his civil rights and had to wait behind barbed wire, guarded by the U.S. Army, with machine guns and guard towers and spotlights. And the Army said, well, you know, we're doing it for your protection in case somebody harms you. We want to take you to these remote places and we'll guard you. And when they put them in the camps, everybody noticed, well, if you're trying to protect us, why are the machine guns pointed in our direction into the camps? Point them in the other direction. So having said all that, I interviewed about 50 Nisei soldiers. And I said, why would you have joined the Army? What, you know, I can't understand. Tell me why you would join the Army. And without an exception, they said, because we want to prove what happened was wrong. Forever. Now it's funny, I'm now 65 years old. When I interviewed him, I was 30 years old. And when I heard that, I didn't quite understand what they were saying, but now that I'm 65 years old, I can understand what they were thinking about their lives in retrospect. And they said, we knew we were going to have kids someday and grandkids, and we didn't want them to experience what we went through. And if we did a good job, and we went overseas and proved ourselves, maybe the discrimination would end. So these guys are 19 and 20 years old, 21, and they're thinking 50 years ahead or 60 years ahead, you know, that if they did a good job, that the discrimination would end. And as early as 2 years into the war, the U.S. Army and the State Department and the War Relocation Authority was saying, I think we made a mistake. We made a terrible mistake. Their war record is so incredible that the people, the decision makers, Stimson and John J. McCloy, the Undersecretary of War, said, I think we screwed up. We better do something right away to try to make it better. So there was a movement to close the camps and to relocate the college-age students into college to try to reverse the damage. So even during the war record had begun to change the face of American politics. It was incredible that their war record was so spectacular, so quickly, that it began to reverse itself almost immediately. So when the veterans came home, by the way, they became very active in the American Civil Rights Movement. So they said, you know, since we are the most decorated unit for size and length of service, how about those 509 laws? And Mike Masaoka said to me, Eric, the story of this exhibit is not just about what we did in the war, but what we did afterwards as well. And it's going to relate to unlikely liberators. So the Nisei veterans in Hawaii and on the mainland began to challenge all those laws in state and federal court and local. For example, there was the anti-miscegenation laws. You know what anti-miscegenation laws are? That a so-called colored person, anybody who wasn't white, couldn't marry a white person or vice versa. So a Japanese American or a Chinese or a Filipino or an African American could not marry a white person. It was against California, Oregon, and Washington state laws. So a Nisei veteran who had won the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest medal, got together with the JECL and he wanted to marry a Haole woman, a Hakujin, a white woman. And they showed up at the courthouse in Washington, and the judge said, it's illegal, I can't marry you. So they took it to federal court, and the anti-miscegenation law was challenged, and it was overturned. So the veterans themselves, and again, you cannot read this in any history book that I've ever read, which talks about the role of the Niseis as civil rights workers in America in the 1940s and 50s. So it was basically 20 years predating the classic African American civil rights movements of the mid-1960s. So they challenged all 509 laws, and they were all overturned by the Japanese American Citizen League, by Mike Masaoka, and by the Nisei veterans who worked together. And Mike Masaoka, a very interesting man, he was in charge of the JACL, so the Army told him, you have to go in to the camps, and you have to tell everybody that they have to go too, and there'll be no resistance. That is the decision of the government. So 120,000 people have to go, and if you don't go, we will use whatever force is necessary to remove you, including deadly force. He told that to the two senior members of the Japanese American Citizen Leagues, and he said, but you can't tell anybody that we threatened you, essentially. So they had to go to the, can you imagine going to your community and saying, well, you have to go now, you have 5 days, 6 days, 2 weeks at the most, you can pack 2 bags, you have to sell everything you own and move into a place you don't know where it is or when it is or under what circumstances, and your life is a complete unknown, and that you're completely humiliated. And you know you're not guilty. By the way, as a backdrop to this, the FBI, Army and Navy intelligence in Hawaii, the FBI in California, the FBI in Hawaii, had investigated the Japanese American community starting in the early 1930s for the idea of would they be disloyal in the event of a war in the Far East. And J. Edgar Hoover determined that there was no threat whatsoever, that it was an extraordinarily loyal community and there was nobody that was on a dangerous list. So when the decision was made by the Army to do that, they knew that fact, and they manipulated that fact so that when the evidence was presented to President Roosevelt and to the Secretary of War, those convenient facts that Army and Navy and the FBI said this is completely unnecessary. J. Edgar Hoover said the internment was completely irrelevant and unnecessary. And that information was withheld from the federal government. So it was challenged by 3 test cases. Did you know that? There was 3 test cases in California, Terabayashi and Korematsu and Endo. And the Supreme Court upheld the legality of the internment. Said it was necessary. In the Constitution, they have a war powers clause called military necessity, which is a catch-all. So you can do whatever you want in time of war. So under the rubric of military necessity, the internment was done. But when the evidence was presented by the U.S. Army in favor of internment, the specific evidence that there was no evidence of sabotage or danger or disloyalty was withheld from the Supreme Court. So in the mid-1980s, 1984, 85, those test cases came before the appellate courts, the federal courts, and they were vacated on the premise that the government had withheld crucial evidence to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court was making an erroneous decision based on false evidence. It was called coram nobis. So again, why am I saying all this? Why is this important? Because this same thing was beginning to happen in Europe in the early 1930s. When Adolf Hitler comes to power in 1933, by the way, when Hitler comes to power, he's had in mind since the early 1920s, where he wrote his book, that he was going to try to eliminate the Jews of Europe. And there were 10.5 million Jews in Europe. So he was obsessed. We don't know why. Since the publishing of his Mein Kampf, he railed against the evil Jewish empire. So the minute he came to power, he had his officers and his generals and his political leaders begin to write discriminatory laws, hundreds of discriminatory laws against the Jewish population. And they were called the Nuremberg Laws, and they came out in 1935. And there were hundreds of them. Again, interestingly not based on any threat, as it turns out, the German and the Austrian Jews, does this sound familiar? Were among the most loyal and patriotic citizens of Germany. The German Jews thought themselves, first they were Germans, secondary they were Jews, and they were not particularly religious. They were very secular, and they were so, they'd been living in Germany for 1,000 years, and they could not know what hit them. So if Hitler's going to come up with discriminatory laws, he's going to look for a precedent. Again, most people don't know this. Where are those discriminatory laws? Where is there a good place to discuss discriminatory laws or to look for a precedent? The United States of America. So he sent his officers of the SS down to the South to collect all the information on Jim Crow laws and the laws against Asian Americans. So the Nuremberg laws, the famous laws that culminated in the Holocaust, had their genesis, their germ of creation in America. And we never learned that in school, did we? No, we didn't learn it. A country where it was founded on slavery, and there was 240 years of slavery, and it was 240 years of slavery and 100 years of oppression and 50 years of fighting for civil rights if you're an African American. And African Americans are still fighting for their civil rights and still fighting. The American Civil War is still being fought, in the South to this day. So the irony, it struck me when I looked at the pictures of barracks in the deserts, and I looked at pictures of Dachau, which began in 1933, they looked very similar to me. The rows of black barracks and guard towers and machine guns and the suspension of civil rights. Very similar. The end product was entirely different. But the process, the genesis, the idea of racism, the ideas of misunderstanding, and the idea of unchecked, unbridled political power by people of bad will. And if that is the combination, people tend to follow the ideas of people, sometimes for good or sometimes for bad. And in Europe, the consequence was 13 years of an increasing terror on a population of 10.5 million people, which resulted in the murder of 6 million Jews and 5 million others, and the collective deaths of 60 million people died in World War II. And in World War II, civilians died at a rate of 3 civilians for every soldier that died. So World War II was the greatest catastrophe, the death of human life, specifically civilians, in wartime in the history of the world.